Remember 2008, the Obama election? It felt like this huge, shared cultural moment, right? All about earnestness and that iconic hope poster. Now, let's jump forward just 8 years to 2016. The entire political world was suddenly being defined by these chaotic, ironic, and honestly pretty baffling memes of a cartoon frog. So what on earth happened? How did things change so dramatically, so fast? Well, today we're going to use Angela Nagle's book, Kill All Normies, as our map to figure out that massive cultural earthquake that we now call the online culture wars. All right, let's get right into it. First up, we're going to see how the weirdest, most anonymous corners of the internet basically forged a brand new and super powerful political force. Then we'll get into the engine of the whole thing, this ideological arms race. It's this wild feedback loop where each side's crazy extremism just fed the other. And finally, we'll look at how the online right did something really clever. They didn't just fight back. They actually learned from and straight up adopted the countercultural tactics of their biggest enemies. So this right here, this is the core puzzle. I mean, on one side, you've got 2008's top-down, officially approved message of optimism, something people shared with total, unironic sincerity. And on the other, you have 2016's totally bottom-up, user-generated, and deeply sarcastic meme culture that just left the entire mainstream media scratching their heads. To even begin to understand how we got from point A to point B, we have to go back to where it all started. So first, let's take a look at how all this was born. Not in some political think tank, but in the anonymous, chaotic, digital petri dish of the early internet. The story really kicks off on sites like 4chan. Just try to imagine a place with zero registration, no history, where absolutely everyone is just anonymous. This created an environment where the absolute darkest humor, the most shocking stuff imaginable, could be shared with zero consequences. It basically became a meme factory, and the entire culture was built on breaking every single social rule you can think of, often just for the fun of it, or as they put it, for the lulz. You know, what's really wild about this quote is just how self-aware this culture was. This user's description, that's not an apology, it's a boast. It reveals a worldview that actively, proudly rejected any and all moral limits. It saw transgression, the very act of crossing lines, as a good thing in itself. It was a place that celebrated shutting off that little voice in your head, your conscience that says, hey, maybe don't do that. And you know, this transgressive energy, it wasn't always political. It started out with silly, pretty harmless pranks like LOL cats and rickrolling that even your parents knew about. But then something shifted. Events like Gamergate in the early 2010s happened, and for the very first time, all that chaotic, anonymous energy got focused on a specific target, in this case, feminist critics in the video game world. It was proof that trolling and online harassment could actually be organized, that it could be used as a weapon. And by 2016, that subculture and its tactics were fully weaponized in a presidential election. But here's the thing. This culture didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was one half of a really volatile chemical reaction, and a lot of its power came from what it was pushing back against. And this is absolutely crucial to understand. This wasn't just two sides having a disagreement. Nagle calls it an ideological arms race. It was a self-perpetuating system, like a fire that creates its own wind. It was a feedback loop where the actions of one side became the perfect excuse for the other side to get even more extreme, which, you guessed it, just gave the first side an excuse to escalate even more. And this slide just perfectly illustrates the two opposing poles. On one side, you had this culture that really flourished on platforms like Tumblr. It was all about identity, safety, and this kind of competitive vulnerability. It led to a super sensitive call-out culture where basically anything could be declared problematic, creating this very rigid, almost puritanical list of rules. And well, that just created the perfect enemy for the hyper-cynical, anti-PC culture of 4chan, which absolutely lived to mock that exact kind of earnest rulemaking. And this quote from Nagle just nails the dynamic perfectly. As one side got more sensitive, more focused on policing language, the other side just slammed the accelerator on its taboo-breaking, offensive, and shocking style, not in spite of the other side, but because of it. It was pure reaction. We saw this cycle play out over and over and over. It starts with something like Coney 2012, a moment of sincere, shared virtue. Then comes the backlash, the scrutiny. Then public disgrace and humiliation become a kind of sport. And after you see this happen for years, you end up with something like Harambe, a meme that was basically just a giant parody of the whole performance of public outrage. It was born from this deep, nihilistic cynicism that had finally boiled over into the mainstream. But the new online right didn't just respond with mockery, and this is where things get really fascinating. In a wild twist, it started to learn from and even adopt the core strategies of the political left. This is what Nagel calls the Gramscians of the right. They basically took a theory from an Italian Marxist thinker, Antonio Gramsci, who said that if you want to get political power, you first have to win the battle of ideas in the culture itself. Figures like Andrew Breitbart boiled it down to a perfect catchphrase: politics is downstream from culture. They realized that if you want to change politics, you first have to change the media, the art, the humor, the whole vibe. So what did they do? Well, they pretty much took the left's historical playbook and just ran with it. They started positioning themselves as the real counterculture, the actual rebels. They embraced transgression, they adopted an anti-establishment identity, and probably most importantly, they built their own alternative media ecosystem from scratch to completely bypass the old mainstream gatekeepers. And this was a huge break from traditional conservatism. I mean, the old right of someone like Pat Buchanan was all about defending tradition and moral order. The new online right, personified by figures like Milo Yiannopoulos, was about blowing all that up. They championed being dangerous and transgressive, and they sounded way more like a 1960s counterculture slogan like "it is forbidden to forbid" than anything you'd hear from the moral majority. And they were shockingly good at it. While a lot of the liberal internet was busy creating kind of sentimental clickbait, the so-called alt-right, this more media-savvy crew focused on cultural provocation, not to be confused with the explicitly white nationalist alt-right, was busy building a massive media empire of YouTubers, bloggers, and meme makers that played by its own rules entirely. And I mean, the numbers really show just how powerful this all became. Now look, these metrics aren't a perfect apples-to-apples comparison. You've got unique visitors for a site like Upworthy versus monthly views for a YouTube channel like The Rebel Media, but you can absolutely see the scale we're talking about. The point is, they created this incredibly potent ecosystem that could shape stories and narratives completely outside the control of traditional media. So at the end of the day, the most important takeaway is this. This wasn't just a bunch of random, angry arguments online. It was a system. It was an ideological arms race that created its own incentives. Things like going viral, getting engagement, having cultural clout. And every single one of those incentives pushed people towards the extremes, towards the poles, leaving the so-called normie mainstream way, way behind. And that leaves us with a really critical thought. The culture wars might have started out on the fringes, but their tactics, their dynamics, they've now become the standard playbook for mainstream politics. The feedback loops, the trolling, the culture-first strategy, that stuff isn't just for weird corners of the internet anymore. It is the mainstream. So the real question isn't if we're in this cycle of escalation anymore. It's how in the world we navigate it now that it's become the new normal.